Documented information is a necessity to prove compliance and to ensure that the ISMS delivers its intended outcomes. The requirements on documented information are not specific for a certain step of the implementation project, which is why we cover them in the very beginning. The documented information requirements are located in subclause 7.5 of the support clause. Subclause 7.5 consists of three further subclauses: 7.5.1 General, 7.5.2 Creating and Updating, and 7.5.3 Control of Documented Information. We are going to have a look at each of these subclauses and learn what the requirements are, what these requirements imply, and how to implement the required activities. In other words, we are going to answer the questions on what needs to be done, why does it have to be done, and how can it be done. Alright, so let's begin with 7.5.1 General. The required activity of this subclause is the organization includes documented information in the ISMS as directly required by ISO 27001, as well as determined by the organization as being necessary for the effectiveness of the ISMS. In the context of management systems, we need to distinguish between documents that express the intentions and directions of an organization and data saved for later reference. Policies, procedures, guidelines, and so on are the written statements that express an organization's intentions and directions. They provide guidance and direction to all members of the organization on how things should be done. Records, on the other hand, are the documented evidence of the activities performed and the results achieved. They provide a historical record of what was done, when it was done, and by whom. A company's health and safety policy, environmental policy, or quality policy are examples of policies. These policies outline the organization's commitment to specific areas and provide guidance on how to meet these commitments. Daily safety inspection reports, employee training records, or an incident ticket are common examples of records. These records provide evidence of the actions taken and the results achieved in each respective area. When it comes to documented information, we also need to distinguish between mandatory and optional documented information. Mandatory documented information is directly required by the standard and has to be available when seeking to get certified. Optional documented information is not directly required by the standard, but organizations are free to determine additional pieces of information that they consider as necessary for their specific needs. Here you can see all the mandatory documented information that is required by clauses 4 through 10. This includes the scope of the ISMS, an information security policy, information security risk assessment process, information security risk treatment process, a statement of applicability, information security objectives, evidence of competence, evidence for processes being carried out as planned, results of information security assessments, results of information security risk treatment, an audit program, the results of audits, results of management reviews, results of monitoring and measurement, nature of the nonconformities and any subsequent actions taken, and results of any corrective action. Please note that Annex A contains additional requirements on documented information, but they only apply if the corresponding controls have been selected as part of risk treatment. So please keep that in mind. Next up, let's have a look at 7.5.2, Creating and Updating. The required activity is, when creating and updating documented information, the organization ensures its appropriate identification and description, format and media, and review and approval. First, it's important to understand that creating and updating documentation is a process that requires careful planning and attention to detail. This means that organizations need to identify how their documentation should be structured and choose a suitable documentation approach. To make the documentation process as efficient and effective as possible, organizations should create a structured documented information library. This library should include a framework for the structure of the documentation, standard structures for different types of documentation, templates for different types of documentation, and clear guidelines for preparing, approving, publishing, and managing the documentation. At the top of the pyramid is the policy. A policy is a high-level document that sets out the organization's overall goals and objectives. It's the foundation of the documentation system and sets the direction for everything else. Beneath the policy are the processes. A process is a set of activities that are put in place to achieve a specific goal. They are the building blocks of the documentation system and provide the structure and framework for everything else. Beneath the processes are procedures. Procedures are step-by-step instructions for how to carry out specific activities. They are the detailed instructions that explain how to implement the process and achieve the goals set out in the policy. Beneath the procedures are the standards. Standards are specific requirements that must be met in order to achieve the goals set out in the policy and the processes. They provide the level of detail and quality control that's necessary to ensure that everything is done correctly. Finally, at the bottom of the pyramid are the records. Records are the evidence that the activities have been carried out correctly and that the goals set out in the policy and processes have been achieved. They provide the proof that everything is working as it should. Together, these 5 types of documents make up the documentation pyramid. The policy provides the overall direction, the processes provide the structure, the procedures provide the detailed instructions, the standards provide the level of quality control, and the records provide the evidence that everything is working as it should. It's important to note that each level of the pyramid builds on the one beneath it, and that each level is dependent on the one above it. Without a strong policy, the processes and procedures will lack direction. Without detailed procedures, the standards can't be met, and without standards and records, it's impossible to prove that the goals have been met. Let me show you an example of a structured documentation library. For this example, I've used an app called Notion that allows me to set up a documentation library. Here we have policies, procedures, standards, and even processes, and all sorts of documentation that you can imagine. It's important to include common attributes in every document, such as document type, purpose and scope, title, date of publication, classification, reference number, version number, and a revision history. This allows for clear and unique identification of each document. When it comes to the actual content of the documentation, it's important to keep in mind the audience and scope of the documentation. Statements and writing style should be tailored to the audience and scope of the documentation. Duplication of information in documented information should be avoided, and cross-references used rather than replicating the same information in different documents. Finally, it's important to ensure that documentation is regularly reviewed and subject to approval. Suitable review criteria can be timing related, for example, a maximum time periods between document reviews, or content related. Approval criteria should be defined, which ensures that the documented information is correct, suitable for the purpose, and in an adequate form and detail for the intended audience. In summary, creating and updating documentation is a process that requires careful planning and attention to detail. By following the guidance outlined in this video, organizations can ensure that the documentation is appropriate, accurate, and useful for their intended audience. Let's see what else needs to be considered. Subclause 7.5.3 deals with the control of documented information. The required activity is the organization manages documented information throughout its life cycle and makes it available where and when needed. This includes ensuring the information is accurate, maintaining its confidentiality and relevance, and protecting it from unauthorized changes. A structured documentation information library can help with this. All of the information must be classified and handled in accordance with its level of sensitivity. A change management process should be in place to control who can make changes and distribute the information. The organization should also determine who the relevant parties are for each piece of information and how it should be distributed. Retention periods for the information should be established, and the organization should have a plan in place for disposing of information that is no longer needed. Additionally, they should also manage any external information received from customers, partners, or regulatory bodies. The level of documentation for this activity is up to the organization's discretion. The implementation of that requirement is pretty straightforward. We need a system that allows us to distribute the information within the organization. The distribution should comply with any requirements related to protecting and handling of classified information. Because not all information is intended for everyone, such a system needs some sort of access control so we can grant and remove access rights whenever necessary. A change management process ensures that only authorized persons with approval rights are capable of making changes to documented information. At the end of its life cycle, documented information needs to be retained. This is why organizations should establish an appropriate retention period for documented information in accordance to its intended validity and other relevant requirements.